Hello, this week, nothing as exciting as the early York Spoon, but exciting in a different way to me. I joked it would be a cheap pair of sugar tongs. Actually, it was an expensive pair of sugar tongs. I noticed in a catalogue earlier this week the description I love to find, which is white metal. This is what happens if an item isn't fully and clearly hallmarked. A lot of auctioneers, a lot of dealers will sell it as white metal to cover themselves under the implications of the Hallmarking Act, although actually it doesn't apply to antiques, as you can quite happily tell with a lot of provincial and colonial silver, which is peculiarly marked but is quite freely described as silver. So these could have been described as silver, but they were described as white metal. And they're sugar tongs. Now, you've probably not seen, unless you're a sugar tong collector, we haven't shown a pair of tongs like this before, with this very flared out bow and curved in that direction, curved arms this way and a curved and flared bow that way. This is a typically Scottish style of sugar tong, but it is also made alongside the English style. Now, I've got an Exeter pair, just to show you. That is a typical English style of tong. You get cast arms earlier. Go back and have a look at the absolute 4-part epic I did on sugar tongs nearly a year ago now, if you can bear it. But you'll see the different types. You won't see a pair like this because I didn't have a pair at the time to talk about. In Scotland, pairs like this are made at the same time. It depends on your taste. These, I think, were very much more expensive. They're certainly heavier and they require much more technical skill. These are made roughly in one piece of silver, and the bowls are very simply stamped out. These, although it may not be obvious to you, in fact, the silversmith went to great pains for it not to be obvious to you, are made in 3 pieces. This section always has to be hand wrought, hammered out by hand from a little rod or section of silver to give it the strength to be used as a pair of tongs. It's sprung, it has tensile strength. This decoration here can only be achieved by casting. And when you cast metal, as I've said in the past, that is inherently slightly weaker. What you have here are 2 cast sections, 2 identical cast sections, and they have been soldered here, but they have been overlapped. So very cleverly, this shell here is like that, and the wrought arm that is underneath it is like this. So they're soldered like that. So we're looking close up, and if you look really closely, I mean really closely, you have to be looking for it, around the edges of the shell, you can just see traces of where the original solder was. But it's so, I mean, you really have to be looking. And on this side, on the inside, you don't get a line as you do with other tongs because it's curved and because it's been hammered over. But what you do get is a slight discoloration in that area, there and there, where it's been soldered. So they're made in 3 pieces. There's casting and there's hand raising involved. They're this form, we believe, or people that collect tongs believe, to make them a bit stronger. Anyone that knows anything about metal, if you curve metal, start to bow it and bend it, it can become stronger. It's a bit like strengthening with an arch. And this flared section, which is where obviously tongs always used to crack, it's been built up to be stronger, to be heftier. This style comes in about 1770. It's an early style of Scottish tong. It's produced alongside an English style of tong in Scotland, and it can occur as late as 1840, 1850 by firms such as Robert Gray and Sons. Now, I was excited to see these because they were Scottish, and I knew they were early just by looking at them. And the reason I knew they were early is because this section here, this cast section, is quite long. It forms quite a large proportion of the whole length of the arm. As the years go on, the decades go on, this section becomes less elaborate, the arm, the wrought arm, becomes slightly longer, and this can turn just into a plain wasted piece of metal or a little turned baluster casting. So this larger section meant they were going to be early. There was no other mark on other than a maker's mark. The maker's mark on these pairs of tongs like this are almost always struck on this section here, because it's the only flat piece of metal. You don't want to be striking a hard flat punch into a curved piece of metal. It causes all sorts of damage. Latterly, sometimes they are marked here, because this very centre of this can take it, but it set up an inherent weakness in the metal. And certainly Robert Gray ones that you might see with full assay marks are sort of marked in a cruciform form at the top there. If you saw cruciform marks in the top of a pair of these, you would not suspect that they were 18th century. You would suspect they were later 19th century in this style, which does occur. Beautiful script initials. The Scottish do love their florid, large script initials. So I was excited by these because firstly, they were in for very little money. They didn't cost very little money. They cost a fortune, but they were in for very little money. They were clearly Scottish, and they only had a maker's mark. Now, just having a maker's mark alone doesn't mean they're provincial. You can get examples like this. In fact, you get a lot of examples like this from Edinburgh and from Glasgow. But actually, when the auctioneer had written out what the mark was, I did recognise it. And it's quite a rare mark, and we'll again look at that in close-up. It's A and ID. Now, there is another maker, Aitchison, that you'll see pairs similar to this, AIT, and they're nice, they're lovely tongs. It'd be lovely to have a pair, but they're commonplace. AID is a very rare mark indeed. In fact, this small punch is not a version of this mark I've seen before. I've seen a larger version, which is A ampersand ID. In fact, I've marked it in this book, Scottish Provincial Silversmith, very good book. It's illustrated, and you will see it here. A and ID with a fringed S, and it's actually for the father and son partnership of Archibald and James DL of Dumfries. They only worked together from about 1770 to 1776. In 1776, Archibald set up with another maker, John Hunter, and they worked for even shorter period of 3 years. I did discover Dale and Hunter's mark in partnership. It's one of the things I've written an article about over the years. This spoon actually came from the Howe sale all those years ago, and it was down as provincial or colonial unidentified. And I bought it with the very strong suspicion, because of the way this heel was done, and the fact that it bore a fringed S mark, which isn't exclusively Scottish. It rarely turns up on a few other places, but this particular fringed S is the identical fringed S on the earlier Archibald and James DL marks, so that had been reused. It's also got what we call, it might be an imitation of the leopard lion passant, but we call it a cap mark when it turns up in Scotland. So I think they get very touchy about having lion passants on Scottish. Even the suggestion of having them on Scottish silver inflames some personalities. And it's got the maker's mark D and H, the ampersand, not clearly struck, but clearly struck enough to make it out. The annoying thing about that was I wrote an article identifying these marks, and 3 weeks later, the only other tablespoon I've seen with these marks turned up online at auction, and the chap didn't know what it was. And if I hadn't written the article, I could have bought it for buttons, but I did write the article, so somebody else outbid me at many hundreds of pounds. That serves you right, but I'm happy they did, because it confirmed, it was a much clearer impression than this. It confirmed what those marks were. I still regret not buying that other one now. What's interesting as well, and it relates to these tongs, is a couple that collected Scottish provincial teaspoons got in touch with me after reading it, and they had a little teaspoon, but it didn't have this mark on it, this big D ampersand H, it had a small D and H mark on it, on a teaspoon, and they've been wondering what it was for years, and I said, well, it is this rare Dumfries partnership, and they were delighted. But it shows you that with Scottish makers, particularly provincial makers, but all makers, they had two sizes of mark at least. They had one mark for the big stuff, objects, big pieces of table silver. That's the punch you often see identified in guides and books. They had a smaller punch for small work, for wine labels, for tongs, for buckles, for all the little bits that they were asked to make. And this is exactly what this mark is. This is the small version of Archibald and James DL's maker's mark. And it's the first time I've seen it. It's very rare. Anything from this partnership, anything from DL and Hunter, well, you've won the lottery if you find anything with their marks on it, believe me. I've only now seen two tablespoons, including this one, and 1 teaspoon bearing that mark. So that's fantastically rare. Archibald and James DL, were working, only for 3 years longer than the later partnership. Their stuff, you might be able to find some. You might be able to find a spoon. Spoons have come up at auction. This is the first time I've seen a pair of sugar tongs by them, and it's certainly one of the most splendid pairs of Scottish sugar tongs that I've seen of this form. They're absolutely perfect. They're filthy black when I bought them. Absolutely glorious. So it does show that it is still all out there to be found. So hopefully that's a small introduction to Scottish silver sugar tongs of this form. They don't turn up as often as they used to be perfectly honest. And just remember, if this section is longer and more decorated, they tend to be earlier. And also, if they're marked here, it's a good sign. If they're marked here, that generally means they're going to be 19th century. But beautiful things. I hope you've enjoyed seeing them, and hopefully I'll find something at auction next week that I'm able to talk to you about. Until then, good antiques hunting and goodbye.